Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Kiran Fatma and I would like to welcome you back to our series of programs on biology. The topic of discussion is physiology with a particular emphasis on the conduction of the nerve impulse and the physiology of the muscle tissue. Since we are going to discuss the physiology of the muscle tissue, it's important to recall our concept of coordination. This information will help us better understand the complex mechanism of conduction of nerve impulse. You may be aware, having read about the different types of living organisms found on Earth, that as you climb up the ladder of evolution, there is an increased trend of division of labor among cells and tissues that forms organs, that form specialized structures, whose function is integrated with each other and regulated by various mechanisms. You know that integration means unifying different activities to different things in order to reach a specified goal. In our case, it may be digestion of food, response to a stimulus, or nervous coordination, that is conducting a nerve impulse. Organization means working together in a regular manner so that timing and relationship result in a smooth and effective activity. All these activities can be achieved by a process which is known as coordination. Coordination is the remarkable ability to maintain a stability in the internal environment, which is called homeostasis. In short, we can say that coordination is brought about by the nervous and endocrine systems. Let's first discuss about the nervous coordination. The functional unit of nervous system are known as neurons or nerve cells. Neurons are specialized to produce signals that can be communicated rapidly and precisely to other cells. The nervous system of snail, frog, human, or any other complex animal is constructed through three types of neurons: sensory neurons, intermediary neurons, and the last one is motor neurons. Sensory neurons serve as the receptors or are activated by the receptor tissue organ. They are stimulated by changes in the external or internal environment and respond by relaying signals to integration centers such as the spinal cord. Intermediary neurons or interneurons are located in these integration centers, which interpret the information arriving on the sensory lines and then influence other neurons in response. The third type of neuron is the motor neuron, which relays information away from the integrating centers, and these integrating centers are the brain and spinal cord. The motor neurons relay information away from these integrating centers to the body's effector tissue organs such as the muscles and gland cells. Neurons come in various sizes and shapes, but they all have three parts: dendrites, axon, and cell body. The dendrites, which has come from the Greek word dendro, means tree, receives information from other neurons and generally conduct nerve impulse towards the cell body. The axon, which means axis, conducts nerve inputs away from the cell body. The cell body contains the nucleus and other organelles typically found in cells. One of the main functions of the cell body is to manufacture neurotransmitters, which are chemicals stored in the secretory vesicles at the end of axons. The important point to note is that the dendrites and axons are sometimes very long. They are then referred to as fibers. The dendrites and axons in higher animals are covered with white myelin sheath, as you can see in this diagram. The neurons are grouped together to form a nerve. Now we come to the electrochemical phenomenon, involving the movement of unequally distributed ions on either side of a neuron plasma membrane. Later, Hodgkin and Huxley, the English neurophysiologists, proved this to be true when they managed to insert a tiny electrode into the giant axon of the giant squid, as you can see here in this diagram. The squid axon produces rapid muscle contraction so that the squid can move quickly. The squid was selected for the experiment because its axon is so large, it is about 1 millimeter in diameter. So it is convenient to put a microelectrode in it. When the axon is not conducting a nerve impulse, the electrode registers and the oscilloscope records a resting potential of 65 MV, as you can see in this figure. Just prior to an axon conducting a nerve impulse, the threshold for an action potential has been achieved, followed by a rapid change in potential from 65 MV to 40 MV, which is known as depolarization, followed by a return to 65 MV, which is known as repolarization. You can see here in this figure the rise of potential from 65 MV to 40 MV. The details of the action potential and resting can be well explained with the figures which are given here. The action potential is the result of an exchange of sodium ions and potassium, and it is shown as a change in polarity by an oscilloscope. When a neuron is not conducting a nerve impulse, the sodium and potassium gates are closed, as you can see here in this figure. The sodium-potassium pumps maintains the uneven distribution of these ions across the membranes. You can see in the figure very clearly the oscilloscope registers a resting potential of 65 MV inside compared to outside. An action potential begins when the sodium gates open and sodium ions move to the inside. It is very clear in this diagram the movement of sodium ions from outside to inside. The oscilloscope registers a depolarization as the cytoplasm reaches 40 MV compared to tissue fluid. You can see in this graph registering depolarization by oscilloscope to 40 MV from 65 MV. The action potential continues as the sodium gates close and the potassium gates open, allowing potassium ions to move to the outside. The oscilloscope registers repolarization as the cytoplasm becomes 65 MV as compared to figure fluid. The oscilloscope registers 65 MV again as the sodium-potassium pump works to restore the sodium-potassium ion distribution. The gates of sodium and potassium are now closed but will open again in response to another stimulus. When the axon is not conducting an impulse, the oscilloscope records a membrane potential equal to about 65 MV, indicating that the inside of the neuron is more negative than the outside. Once again, you see this diagram which shows the above statement. This is called the resting potential because the axon is not conducting any impulse. Dear students, now we come to the second part of our program, that is the physiology of the muscles. We'll take the example of the skeletal muscles and study their structure and action. Each skeletal muscle is composed of many muscle fibers that contract when they are stimulated by the motor neurons. Each motor neuron branches to integrate a number of muscle fibers, and all of these fibers contract when their motor neuron is activated, to give rise to a coordinated contraction by all muscle fibers. The number of neurons activated determines the gradation in the strength in the contraction of the whole muscle. For example, for a heavy loader activity, many neurons are activated, whereas for a light loader activity, only few neurons are activated. Through these diagrams, you can see the action of skeletal muscle. In this diagram, you can see the extensor that increases the angle at a joint whereby the knee straightens. The flexor, on the other hand, decreases the angle at a joint as shown in this figure. The abductor moves the limb towards the middle of the body. The abductor moves limb away from the midline of the body. Other categories of muscle actions include the elevator moves insertion upward, whereas depressor moves insertion downward. The rotator rotates the bone and the sphincter constricts an opening. As a result, the opening either narrows or is completely closed. In all cases, the skeletal movements are produced by the shortening of the appropriate muscle groups, the agonizers, while the antagonist remains relaxed. The fibrous connective tissue proteins within the tendon continue an irregular arrangement around the muscle to form a sheath which is known as epimysium. Connective tissue from the outer sheath extends into the body of the muscle, subdividing into columns or fascicles. Each of these fascicles is thus surrounded by its own connective tissue sheath known as perimysium. A muscle fascicle is composed of many muscle fibers or myofibers. Each is surrounded by a cell membrane or sarcolemma, enveloped by this connective tissue layer called endomysium, the muscle cells. Since the connective tissue of the tendons, epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium is continuous, muscle fibers do not normally pull out of the tendons when they contract. Despite their unusual fiber shape, muscle cells have all the organelles that are present in other cells, such as mitochondria, glycogen granules, and intracellular membrane, and others. But unlike most other cells, muscle fibers are multinucleate. The most distinctive feature of the microscopic appearance of skeletal muscle fibers, however, is their striated appearance. The striations are produced by alternating dark and light bands that appear to cross the width of the fiber. The dark bands are called A bands and the light bands are called I bands. At high magnification in an electron microscope, thin dark lines can be seen in the middle of the I bands. These are called Z lines. The labels A, I, and Z are useful for describing the functional architecture of muscle fiber and were derived during the history of muscle research. The letters A and I stand for anisotropic and isotropic respectively, which indicate the behavior of light as it passes through the regions, whereas the letter Z comes from the German word Zwischenschieb, which means between discs. In this diagram, it is very distinctly explained a muscle fiber contains many myofibrils, sarcolemma, a band, I band, and Z line. While discussing the mechanism of contraction, you must keep in mind that the A bands within each muscle fiber are composed of thick filaments and the I bands contain thin filaments. Movement of cross bridges that extend from the thick to thin filament causes sliding of the filament. Here in this diagram, you can see that over the thick filament, the thin filament is sliding. As a result of this sliding of the filaments, the muscle tension and shortening results. The activity of the cross bridge is regulated by the availability of calcium, which is increased by electrical stimulation of the muscle fiber. Electrical stimulation produces contraction of the muscle through the binding of calcium to regulate proteins within the thin filaments. When muscle cells are viewed in the electron microscope, each cell is seen to be composed of many subunits known as myofibrils. These myofibrils are approximately 1 micrometer in diameter and extended in parallel rows from one end of the muscle fiber to the other. The myofibrils are so densely packed that other organelles such as mitochondria and intracellular membranes are restricted to the narrow cytoplasmic spaces that remain between adjacent myofibrils. In this diagram, you can see the positions of the mitochondria and nucleus, which is in the periphery of the fiber near the sarcolemma. When a myofibril is observed at high magnification in longitudinal section, the A bands are seen to contain thick filament. It is these thick filaments that give A band its dark appearance. The higher I band, by contrast, contains thin filament. The thick filaments are composed of the protein myosin and the thin filaments are composed primarily of the protein actin. We continue our discussion on the mechanism of muscle contraction. The most convincing and important theory of muscle contraction is the sliding filament theory of contraction. According to this theory, when a muscle contracts, it decreases in length as a result of the shortening of its individual fibers. Shortening of the muscle fibers, in turn, is produced by shortening of their myofibrils, which as a result of the shortening of the distance from Z line to Z line. As the sarcomere gets shortened, however, the A bands do not get shortened but instead move close together. The I band, which represent the distance between A bands of successive sarcomere, gets decreased. In this diagram, you can see that the sarcomere is relaxed. The distance between the I bands should be a point to be noted. In the diagram, you can see that the distance between the Z lines decreased and also the distance between I bands is also decreased. Sliding of the filaments is produced by numerous cross bridges that extend out from the myosin towards the actin. As you can see in this figure, the cross bridges are part of the myosin proteins that extend from the axis of the thick filaments to form arms that terminate in globular heads. You can see in this diagram the globular heads from the thick filament of myosin projecting towards actin. The orientation of cross bridges on one side of a sarcomere is opposite to that of the cross bridges on the other side, so that when the myosin cross bridges attach to the actin on each side of the sarcomere, they can pull the actin from each side towards the center. The action of cross bridge can be very effectively understood through this diagram of cross bridge cycle that causes sliding of the filament and muscle contraction. In this figure, the resting fiber is shown. Here you can see that the cross bridge is not attached to actin. The next diagram reveals that the cross bridge of myosin has just binded the actin. Following the previous diagram here, you can see that the power stroke causes filaments to slide. While here you can see that a new ATP binds to myosin head, allowing it to release from actin. While completing the cross bridge cycle, ATP is hydrolyzed, causing the cross bridge to return to its original orientation. Dear student, this phenomenon of sliding filament theory of contraction has more details involving some chemicals like calcium in muscle contraction. In fact, the attachment of calcium to troponin causes movement of the troponin tropomyosin complex, as it is shown in this figure, which exposes binding sites on the actin. The myosin cross bridges can then attach to actin and undergo a power stroke. With this, we come to the end of our program. Till we meet again, I wish you the very best. Allah Hafiz.
Dear students, I am Ajabin. I am here with you with the 10th program of the Intermediate Biology series. This program has been structured to explain to you the environment, the basic components of the environment and their interaction, and the human impacts upon the natural environment. But first, I should like to explain to you that what is ecology. Ecology is the branch of biology that deals with the environment and the components of the environment in relation with the living organisms.
In 1866, German biologist and evolutionist Ernest Haeckel used the word ecology to denote the study of organisms and their interaction with the world around them. The word is based on two Greek words, oikos meaning household and logos meaning study. Ecology is the branch of biology which studies the relationships between living things within the species and between the different species and between them and environment. A person doing research in the field of ecology is known as an ecologist whose research may extend from field studies to experimental studies in laboratory, from population studies to physical composition of rocks, soil, air and water, and directly applied to our daily life in the form of observations of common effects on our natural environment.
In order to understand ecology, we must first understand the basic components of our environment.
With respect to a specific organism, everything around him, including him, is termed as an environment. Our environment consists of two main components, biotic and abiotic components. Bios means life, therefore, as the name suggests, biotic components include all living organisms, whereas abiotic components include non-living components. Biotic components include producers, consumers, and decomposers. The producers, as the name indicates, are the organisms that can produce living matter. And in nature, only plants can produce new living material from non-living material. For this reason, they are called autotrophs. They use their pigments such as chlorophyll, the green pigments found in the leaves, to capture light energy, which they then turn into stored chemical energy to fuel their life processes. This two-stage process is called photosynthesis. Entire life on our planet depends upon the products of photosynthesis. Consumers are those organisms that consume the food prepared by producers. They can be primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers directly feed upon the plants and are called herbivores. Secondary consumers feed upon primary consumers, for example, carnivores. Tertiary consumers feed upon the secondary consumers, for example, primary predators. Those organisms that feed upon the dead organic matter of plant and animals are called as decomposers, for example, microorganisms, fungi, etc.
An ecosystem is fueled by energy, and this energy comes from the sun. The plants, being the only organisms to fix this light energy in organic state, form the first level of energy transfer in an ecosystem. Ecologists refer to these stages as the trophic levels. The energy is transferred from one trophic level to another trophic level. As the plants, when being eaten by animals, the energy is transferred from the producer level to the consumer level, where it is stored in the form of flesh, while some of this energy is also lost to the atmosphere during the transfer.
Plants lie on the first trophic level. Animals feeding upon them form the second trophic level, while carnivores establish the third trophic level and decomposers establish the fourth trophic level. These trophic levels in an ecosystem can be represented by a pyramid. The number of levels varies, but because energy is limited, there are energy losses at each level. Energy is lost in space as heat.
Energy is transferred from one trophic level to another trophic level when one organism feeds upon the other organism. This continuous process of feeding and being fed by other organisms forms a food chain, while different interacting food chains produce a food web.
It is very simple to understand a food chain. You have seen some caterpillar eating leaves of green plants. Then it is eaten by a hen. This hen is eaten by many predators such as cat, humans, etc. The green plants, caterpillar, hen and humans establish a food chain, while green plants, caterpillar, hen and cat establish another food chain. You may have also seen that the green leaves are eaten by caterpillar. Then this caterpillar may be eaten by some bird instead of hen. This bird, for example sparrow, may be eaten by some hawk. Green leaves, caterpillar, sparrow and hawk establish another food chain, and this food chain linking with previous food chain at the caterpillar link establish a simple food web. Similarly, there may be very complex links between different food chains that create complex food web.
These biotic factors, besides interacting with one another, also interact with the abiotic factors, which include air, water, light, and soil.
It is a narrow band of air, water and soil with light source from sun that provides the life-sustaining characteristics called as biosphere. Air is a gaseous mixture of various gases in specific quantities, such as hydrogen, carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, etc. Air provides oxygen to all aerobically respiring organisms. Water constitutes about 70% of all the matter in living organisms by weight. Plants need water in order to take in dissolved minerals through their roots. It is hence critical for both physiological and chemical processes of life. Soil is a reservoir for a large number of nutrients that are essential for life. They are micronutrients, for example zinc, iron, etc., which are required in small quantities, and macronutrients which are required in large quantities, for example hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and calcium. Light is the basic source of energy which is incorporated in plants in the form of organic matter by the process of photosynthesis.
In a biosphere, the energy flows in and out regularly, whereas the chemicals that are essential for life processes, for example water, nutrients, they are limited. Therefore, they have to be continuously recycled.
The nutrients are continuously recycled into the nature by different nutrient cycles. There are two types of nutrient cycles: gaseous nutrient cycles and sedimentary nutrient cycles, called as biogeochemical cycles. The nutrient cycle, in case when major reservoir of the nutrient is the air, the cycle is called gaseous cycle as nitrogen cycle, while when major reservoir of nutrient is in the soil, the cycle is called sedimentary cycle, that is sulfur cycle. Nitrogen cycle involves many steps of nitrogen fixation into nitrates, nitrites and ammonia, and defixation back into free molecular nitrogen of air. Nitrogen fixation primarily occurs due to electric thunder and rains. then further fixation into complex compounds occur both biologically and non-biologically. Thus, formed compounds are utilized by plants and animals via plants. Denitrification occurs both biologically and non-biologically to liberate gaseous nitrogen from nitrogen components found in organic wastes and dead organisms. Among other important nutrients, carbon forms an integral part of cell structure and is continuously being passed through sedimentary and gaseous phases. Every ecosystem depends on some energy source, natural or artificial. Every ecosystem which depends upon sun's energy is known as natural ecosystem, while an ecosystem which depends on some artificial source is known as an artificial ecosystem.
The interactions of abiotic factors produces the specific climate of an area. The life zones of interrelated plants and animals is determined by the climate. This specific set of climatic conditions, which is the home to specific kind of living organisms in a major division of the world, is called as a biome.
There are 7 major biomes in the world: tundra, tropical rainforest, temperate deciduous forest, savanna, grassland, cool desert, desert.
Today, the biodiversity of the biomes is at great risk due to only one species, the humans. Ecologically, the early humans were like any other species, being a natural part of the food web and at being lower trophic levels. But today, due to the advanced survival techniques, we lie at the highest trophic level. And because of the fast-growing population, these impacts are becoming louder day by day.
Since the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, human impacts on the environment have been enormous. The burning of fossil fuels have polluted large areas and significantly altered the atmosphere. Industrial technology has brought millions of people from rural areas into new towns and cities. The consequences of these rapid changes could not be predicted. Now, the science of ecology has made it possible to assess how human actions affect the environment and looking for ways to reduce and repair the damage done by changes like urbanization, industrialization, and rapid deforestation.
Among a large number of negative changes on our environment, one such is global warming. But first, we need to understand the greenhouse effect.
A blanket of gases that form the atmosphere surrounds Earth. They reflect back a few quantity, pass on and absorb some quantity of solar radiation falling on the surface of the Earth. They are responsible for maintaining a stable temperature on the surface of Earth. Otherwise, Earth will be very cold. We all have heard that the temperature of our Earth is increasing year by year. Scientists explain this rise in terms of carbon dioxide accumulation in the environment. The radiations of sun striking our Earth are reflected back, surpassing the needs, but higher contents of carbon dioxide in our environment prohibit this reflection of radiation as they create a blanket around the Earth. When radiations are not reflected back, this causes a rise in temperature known as global warming. The consequences of global warming may be much disastrous, as due to rise in temperature, ice on poles and permanent glaciers is melting, which is causing a rise in sea level. Due to rise in sea level, many islands and coastal cities may be at the edge of submergence. Global warming, compounded with deforestation, becomes very severe. When fossil fuel is burnt in houses or vehicles, it produces carbon dioxide, methane. These gases trap the heat entering the atmosphere of Earth and do not let it to escape, causing a rise in the temperature.
Yet another negative human impact, specifically on vegetation, is the acid rain.
Apart from carbon dioxide, fossil fuels also emit sulfur, nitrogen and phosphorus oxide gases which travel into the atmosphere. Since these gases are water-soluble and generate acids when dissolved in water, so they get dissolved into water vapors of the atmosphere and come down with rain. It can inhibit the tree growth and reduce activity of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and can make toxic aluminium available to fish.
Solutions to put a check on the acid rain have been devised, and several governments are working in this direction.
It is obvious that these gases are water-soluble, so all chimneys emitting these gases must be showered by water. The acid produced may be used commercially. Another way to reduce the acid gas emission is by application of basic chemistry. The best way, however, is to stop burning fossil fuel, use solar, wind and water energy instead of fossil fuel, but this all needs much scientific research, so other preventive measures can be applied.
Another negative impact of humans on our environment is the destruction of the ozone layer. The ozone layer is composed of triatomic oxygen molecules which is present in the Earth's outer atmosphere. One reason for the thinning of ozone layer is the presence of chlorofluorocarbons in our atmosphere. The chlorofluorocarbons are the cooling agents that are used in refrigerators, air conditioners. They have a negative impact on the ozone layer. Now I shall explain to you that how do these gases destroy the ozone layer.
The atoms of oxygen in triatomic molecule of ozone continually associate and dissociate with each other into molecular form, but when there are chlorofluorocarbons in the upper atmosphere, they become bound with atomic radical oxygen and prevent reassociation of this atom into a triatomic molecule of ozone. Thus, due to ozone depletion, the ultraviolet radiations reach the Earth, causing gene mutation and skin cancer of humans and leaf malfunctioning of plants. The question that comes to mind is how to prevent the depletion or destruction of ozone layer. First of all, chlorofluorocarbons must be replaced with less harmful materials or chemicals or coolants. Aerosols, which use chlorofluorocarbons, now have been modified to less harmful chemicals, but in refrigerators and air conditioners, they are still being used continuously. Land pollution too is a result of human activities. Nowadays, plastic shopper bags have become a necessity of our daily life. We use them once and throw them away, and heaps of shopper bags can be observed scattered everywhere in the streets of our towns.
Before we discuss any more of the environmental pollution, let's first explain the difference between the biologically degradable and non-degradable wastes.
Everything which is wasted is of two types: the wastes that are biologically degradable, and those wastes which are biologically non-degradable. Biologically degradable wastes are recycled into nature by nutrient cycles, while biologically non-degradable wastes can't be recycled into food chains. Thus, they reduce soil fertility and consequently cause many other disastrous effects. The wastes of hospitals are dangerous in two ways, as majority of them is biologically non-degradable and carrier of many germs.
Another kind of pollution created by humans is the water pollution. Can be freshwater, can be marine. This too has caused a dilemma in many countries, including Pakistan.
Many industries throw their wastewater with chemicals in it directly into rivers, which is the greatest risk to aquatic life. You may have observed that aquatic population of such rivers has been reduced drastically. Many countries dump their atomic and chemical wastes into the oceans, which cause oceanic pollution. Almost whole transport of petroleum is carried out through oceans, and many times it has happened that some ship got wrecked and whole of the petroleum in it swayed into the ocean.
There are many more environmental pollutions than the ones that have been described here in this program. When we view these, we understand that the future of our generations is at great risk. We must all make global efforts in order to combat these problems. We should adopt modern scientific techniques to dispose biological and non-biological wastes. And we should do research in order to convert the degradable, non-degradable wastes into the degradable wastes. All these measures should be effective and almost immediate. Otherwise, the future scenario of our globe is dark and dismal. We should all perform our duties well, because our environment is the trust of our future generations. Allah Hafiz.